right, our third speaker is doctor?
No, I'm not a doctor yet.
Mr. Ron Williams, and he is going to be speaking about Gongan cultural and spiritual paradigms, and some very interesting information. We're running back about 5 minutes behind, so we're just going to turn it over and get going.
Good. Thank you, and it's great to be back down here in Gongan country. I lectured here at Southern Cross University for about 5 years, and so I know a lot of people in this room. I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Queensland, and I'm doing a thesis by publication, and I'm looking at the Indigenous estate. My background is I've been in business for 32 years, a consultancy business, and I developed a business model within that period, so that's what my thesis is about, looking at that. And I'm adopting an Indigenous story work methodology, telling my story of how I developed the model, and also doing it as an exegesis, so the artefacts that I'm using within my thesis are the Gongan business models and frameworks. And they operate at the cultural interface of community, government and industry. So I have 2 scholarships, one with the University of Queensland and the other one with CRC, Transformation in Mining Economies, top up. And I've passed my 3rd stage review in October 24 and expected to present and finalise my thesis this year. So my connections, I'm Bunjalung, which is by Yugal, right from here. So my mother's grandparents are Bunjalung, so by Yugal and Korokai. My father's side are Gidabal, up with Buttonbong, my 2 grandparents. And my great-grandfather on my mother's side is from Nimboya, so Gongan. So that's where I get my connections to this northern part of the country. But to understand my model and understand me, we need to look at the history. And this is on the Clarence River. You know, the cedar cutters come up there in 1836. There were regional conflicts, you know, around the region, such as Mile Creek and Slaughterman's Gully was very close to Yugal there, and massacre on the Aurora River near Grafton. So all those were going on during that period, and the estimated population was going down because of all those massacres. So what happened, my great-great-great-grandfather, Toobilly Bum, we call him Toobilly, took our family and relocated us from around near where Yugal is up into the Bulldog Scrub, away from all that, in the late 1830s. In 1840, Edward Ogilvie sited Yugal, which is still an operating property, and took on 56 square miles river frontage along both sides of Clarence. In 1841 he arrived at Yugal with 12,000 sheep. In 1842 he first met my great-great-great-grandfather, and he published that meeting in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1842. Now this is a photograph. Now there's Ogilvy riding on his thoroughbred into his property, and sitting over on the fence is my great-great-great-grandfather, and that's what I look at that photograph and say, this is what we were left with. So I suppose that's really driven me in what I do. There's Ogilvy's castle. That's off the Clarence River there. Now my generation, I was born in 1957, so I wasn't born an Australian citizen. I was a ward of the state because I was born in Brisbane. You know, the 67 referendum, the yes vote, gave us certain rights, but the White Australia policy was still in operation until 1973. Terry Nullies was finally overturned by Mabo. 23 referendum, as we all know, you know, a resounding no vote of 60%, and Australia has never signed any treaty with us. So I always ask the question, when I go out and give speeches and that, I say, where do we fit? You know, no matter how many times we've tried to work out what our rights and what our position is in this country, you know, there's always that racist undertone to not let us there. Now, where I started first thinking about my model was in 1993. We had the first National Business and Economic Conference, which I worked with Charlie Perkins and people like that. And Charlie asked me to facilitate the conference. And I've written an article about that. That'll be published in a new International Indigenous Business Journal out of the University of Queensland. And what I got out of that conference was for the barriers to business was political structures, support structures, and financial structures. And I put that into my model as political barriers, the need for support structures, and access to finance. And on the bottom line there, I had cultural, philosophical base. That was the first time I presented. I presented it down at Wanneroo, down in Maitland. And I always said to the audience, look, if you think my model isn't right or you've got some comment, please say. And one of the aunties, she put her hand up and said, you know, I can ask you that. And I said, yeah. And she said, see that word philosophical? That's a white man's word. We are cultural and spiritual people. And the next day, cultural and spiritual base went into that. So I've been using that cultural and spiritual base since 1995 in my business modelling, in my business planning, in helping organisations find their business strategies or their project strategies. So I came to my PhD with two fully developed models that I've been working on the ground for 28 years with across the country, in mining, in tourism, in medical services. In medical service here, I help them sort of stop being auspiced by Kempsey. And so, you know, by focusing on a place-based approach and also ensuring a unique cultural, social, spiritual, environmental and financial context was developed. And the first question I asked, whether they be non-Indigenous organisations or business organisations, what is your cultural and spiritual base? And when I ask that question, I mean, whose nation land are you operating on? Who are the main family groups? Stories from the land and sea, do you know any of those? What's your cultural diversity internally and externally with your clients or your customers and your service? And how's that written into your business plan? And that's my Gongan business model canvas. And as you can see down the bottom there, it's cultural and spiritual base, and that's the basis of that. The second part of them, and that's the culture. And then the second part of that is the Gongan corporate planning model, which, and then the wealth creation model. Now, once I asked all those questions of an organisation or a business, I then pull that data from that. And then I can't start to see where's the risk. Is the risk culturally? Or is it in support structures? Or is it in access to finance? Or what sort of agreement or partnership are people going into? And where's the wealth distribution? Across individual and family wealth, community wealth, corporate wealth, institutional wealth, IPAs and that, and cultural and spiritual wealth, our sites, our dance, our culture. And Gongan jargon, they're Bunjalung words, which means footpath to country. And so that's when I look at the risk across those, all with the platform of cultural and spiritual base. Now, being in business, going back to uni at 64 years old, and learning how to write as an academic, I've written heaps of business plans. I love writing business plans, but academic papers, that's another thing. So I had accumulation of 30 years of action research and refined my things by the diagrams and peer and expert discussions, facilitated workshops, using commissioned consultancy reports to build my models. But at the same time at university, I resisted the pressure of what I call the theory police. The first year I presented at a business forum at the uni, I got totally attacked by the theory police. They were all saying, "Where are your theories? What are you using?" I kept saying, "Look, problem is, I'm looking at all your theories and most of them were developed by the Greeks. What I'm calling on goes way back long before the Greeks. And I just haven't found something that fits my model, because remember, I'm walking into university with a model that I know that works and that operates, and that model came from us. So I just didn't. Now, when you look at the ontological spread of businesses, they fall within traditional not-for-profits, not-for-profits that have a big social enterprise in the Senate, which I elected in for quite a bit, and then for-profit. Now, they all come with a different viewpoint and a different way of doing business. And during my consultancy time, I worked across all of those sectors. And when I worked in the mining industry and the financial industry and the Chamber of Commerce, I've experienced all of those. So when you look at literature research, the triple bottom line, which was developed by Elkington, looks at social, people, environmental, planet, economic profit, And then they were trying to look at the fourth pillar, which was culture, and some also said spirituality. God should be in that fourth sector. And then they said a quintuple, which is 5 pillars, which is somebody did a said place because they looked at the local craft industry and why it's better to get resources and that locally and make the business a bit more sustainable. Now the Gongan quintuple, bottom line, remember I've been operating this since 1995, and Elkington developed his thinking in the early 1990s, you know, in 1993, so I wasn't far behind him. But I didn't know about academia, I was just doing it because I was out there working on the ground. And this is what community and people were asking me, saying, well, when you do our business plans, Rod, we want you to also think about caring for country, caring for family, caring for community. So I had to pull those into my models. And so I have that same thing, social, environmental, economic, cultural, and spiritual is the 5th one, our connection to land. As Auntie said, we are cultural and spiritual people. And that's what I found hard when I was looking at all the academic stuff, the theories. Where do they bring in that spiritual, that connection, our connection we have? And I wasn't finding it anywhere. So what I've developed is the Gongan ontological inquiry framework. And there's 2 questions I ask. What's your cultural and spiritual base? And see, I'm doing a little bit of work with Queensland Ballet, and I've asked them that question. And the lady who's the CEO of Queensland Ballet, she said, oh, right, I'm going to have to go away and think about this, because she said, I'm Sri Lankan, my husband's British, and my children were born in Australia. So that question to me, what does that actually mean? And so Queensland Ballet is going through that process of individual management of working out that question, and then they're going to come back together as an organisation and work out what that question means to them. And then the other thing is place and story, where you're located, whose nation land, that sort of stuff. And so what I'm saying to researchers and business developers is that when you come in, understand your ontology. Why? Because your Western knowledge is going to think differently with your ontology, epistemology, and your axiology. So get an understanding of that as an individual, because Indigenous groups are going to have a different approach, because if you're working at the cultural interface, you're going to have to get a better understanding of this and that. Now, cultural and spiritual base, I not only do that, but I also work with, I bring on the work of Professor Norm Sheen. He developed respectful designs, respectful from the beginning, deep listening, deep equity, resolve power. Like when I go out and run my workshops, I don't start talking about business. I talk about family and talk about how they want business to do, or community. And by the time because they know more about that than I do, and by the time we get to talking about the business stuff, well, they're all confident. And we put that business process within their cultural context, because I've already asked those questions, cultural and spiritual base. Where do you want to position yourself? How do you see this business working? And I use the quintuple bottom line in that. Now, as you see, there's a lot of different nations out there, And that's a diverse lot of models. So my model is able to work across those different diverse groups. And I've been doing that for ages. And as you can see, so Western Indigenous research methodologies and paradigms, we really need to have a look at those and not get pressured by these Western things to fold. But by being in that, like I say, the Gongan ontological inquiry space, we're asking our questions. What is your cultural and spiritual base? Place in the story. So we're positioning ourselves within our business, within our research, and the other thing I'm doing is, and I've written this article with myself, Associate Professor Charlene Leroy-Dyer and Dr. Samantha Coombs, and we wrote about the Indigenous estate, which is something I've had an interest in for quite a while. As you can see, that's the Land Council claim across Australia. This is the native title claims across Australia. My family's been involved in two claims, the Western Bundjalung, which is my mother's side, the Gettable one, which is my father's side, and I suppose the last one, which would cover Nimboida, which is my great-grandfather's side, so we've had two claims, but I don't know. They don't really help. I went through all those workshops and family said, Rod, you just asked too many hard questions. But the questions I was asking about was, let's make this viable. Let's not just roll over. But I got outvoted. We're talking about critical minerals. Most of those critical minerals are on our land. So that's the next big issue that's going to front itself for Australia. You want all these critical minerals, but look at where they are. They're on our land. Now, the Australian National University come out and basically said that, by 2030, 65% of land will have some sort of thing on us, and so we've got a lot of land. But when you look at the Indigenous estate, which I'll go into next, it's a major asset for us. So there's 25 pieces of Commonwealth and state legislation that gives us some say. So even when you look at that map where the native title is, even those areas where there's not a native title on, we still have some rights, in certain areas. So, our thing, and I often say to students when I've lectured to them, I say, look, don't come in thinking you're going to save us. We can make our own decisions, but what we do need, because you're studying accountancy or marine science, we want you to come in partnership and work with us. We know our land, we know our country, and you've got to work alongside us. Not come in and think you're going to save us poor black fellas, because we don't need saving. Now, my model, it breaks wealth up into individual and family wealth. You know, people having employment, job, their own house, small business. Community wealth, the, you know, because, you know, our land councils and our medical services and that, they're all in community wealth. Corporate wealth, you know, our businesses, our joint ventures, and that. Institutional wealth, the IBAs, the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, you know, they hold a lot of our assets. Cultural and spiritual wealth, that's our heritage sites, our dance, our connections, and that. Now what I'm going to do is, in my thesis, is write a definition on the Indigenous estate, which will include these wealth areas. And post-doctorate, I'd like to start talking to all those different wealth areas, so we get a bit more coordinated approach to economic. And, you know, when I say wealth, it's cultural wealth, it's spiritual wealth, it's environmental wealth, it's financial wealth. It's not just the money wealth thing that the triple bottom line likes to just look at. So it's about redesigning methodologies and that to bring in Indigenous values and worldviews. And so, like I said, I'll be, yeah. So when you look at my model, the Gongan cultural and social paradigm, cultural and spiritual paradigm, it's made up of the Gongan ontological framework, which gets individuals and organisations to consider what their cultural and spiritual base is and place and story and belonging. So, you know, I asked Queensland Ballet, how does your business plan look? You've got a nice little story that this was in the West End, the building was an old shoe factory. But what was happening before this was even a shoe factory? And your dance academy is up at Kelvin Grove. What was happening up there? Now you need to understand that and write that into your business plan. It also, you know, looks at that's the cultural and spiritual base and what that means. Also in the paradigm is my Gongan business model canvas. There's been plenty of business model canvases. That's just part of research, and that business model canvases. Well, this one falls with that. And then my Gongan jargon analysis framework. So that's what makes up that paradigm. So, like I said, I just found it very hard walking into university with an already functioning and operating practical business model, that I just couldn't find stuff that would allow it, and it mainly come down to that spiritual connection, that connection that we have to our land. And it's about getting people to understand that when they go out and do research, or when they go out and write business plans, they're coming from either a Western viewpoint, or they could be coming from an African viewpoint or an Asian viewpoint, you know. Getting them to understand that that's a viewpoint, and the people that they are working with are also diverse because of all our nation groups. And that. So I'm open for questions.
I'm really glad at your last slide you had the definitions of that, because I was going to address that afterwards, just people weren't aware of what those terms mean. I often hear people use terms appropriately, but they actually don't know what they really mean, so it's nice to see that up there.
Thank you so much. He used to teach me, he's dead, sorry to swear. And on a serious note, I know a dance school in the Central Coast that would definitely do with your medicine, eh? That's all.
Yeah, my niece is down there at the moment.
My daughter's there.
Yeah.
Too. So,
what are some changes that you'd like to see in academia?
Well, the most horrific experience I had was ethics.
Goodness. Don't get me there.
You know, because they didn't, I've got a model that's very ethical,
Yeah.
and I've been working on it for many years, but that wasn't even considered. I'm an elder within the national business field because I was out there early developing all the business stuff. I'm an elder within my own family, community, so that was never taken into account or anything. And I had a set of white fellas assessing whether I was good enough to go and talk to black fellas. And the thing that really got me was that the people I wanted to interview, Indigenous people, you know, they had significant careers. But all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are vulnerable. So I think the process was just flawed. And that, so, yeah. I suppose I found it hard because I like to write simple, and that's what I did with my business plan, so that community could read it, corporates could read it, and everybody could read my business plans. By coming into academia, I had to throw all those words in, and it's not really me writing, because I write a lot more simpler and make it a lot more simpler, but I'll do it and give it to them. But I am going to write a couple of books, join the crew, I suppose, and write it in my terms.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. It was really interesting. What role do you see, I guess, community controlled organisations playing in, I guess, enterprise or enterprise building, or I guess the economic development? And how is that, I guess, affected by, I guess, the increasing amount of native title as compared to land claims? How do you see the role for community controlled orgs in that space?
Well, I've done a lot of work with organisations who, I suppose it's always a huge risk to continue to have all your money come from government. And I suppose there's always a certain amount of risk that you have under the type of structure you might have. And some of them don't have any choices because those structures come from origin, or they come from either PVC in native title, or whatever. So sometimes you don't have much choice, so you've got to work out how you're going to do that. But I've asked people organisations to think about social enterprise, you know, and that, but that's not for everyone, so I don't force people into it. But what are some of the skills that you hold within your organisation that you could make a business out of, and that could, you know, help not make you so dependent on government funding or philanthropic funding or that sort of thing. So open up your ideas, but it's important to bring everybody along with you. You know, and that's why I run the workshops I run. So people not only talk about the business aspirations, they're also talking about their cultural and spiritual aspirations. And that's what makes my work and my process that I've been doing for 30 years different to anybody else out there across the country. But as I know, they still keep going to the KPMGs and the big accountancy firms because they reckon they got all the answers. But I can tell you, they don't.
Mark, do you think UQ would be interested in doing that differently for Indigenous PhD students so that Indigenous research method? I was at UNE for a while and there was a few Indigenous PhD students who pushed back and managed to not do confirmation of candidature as a combative lecture thing, but out on country with elders. There were cultural elders as supervisors, and then I would always refer to myself as the administrative academic sort of supervisor for an Indigenous student because I shouldn't be in that place other than in that role. But was there, in UNE, they went along with it for a while, and I don't think they've created a structured program that recognises that. UQ is really big. Do you think there's room? I know it depends on the faculty or the school sometimes.
See, I'm part of the Indigenous Business Hub at UQ, and we're starting to gather, students and groups. But whether we will be able to break through that, I don't know. And even I say to UQ, look, you fellas want to start thinking about where you think I might position myself in the future. Because, I'm sure some other university will be interested in what I have to offer. But like I said, I think it's time. The biggest battle I'm having at the moment is CRCs. I'm part of that mining one, and also the water CRC. One basin has asked me to come in and talk to them because I'm saying to them, look, your business processes and that, you got to understand, in mining, as soon as you dug that first hole or put that first drill hole in there, you've damaged our land. Now you want to do rehabilitation and you want to use your Western models again to fix it up? Nah. First place, we've got to work out what is the place in the story of this place. And that has to be written in to how this might be rehabilitated. You've got to involve the locals. And that's the same with water. Look, all those fish dying and all those things. Are they coming in and getting the stories and that first? And I think that's where I've been taken on a bit of a challenge of saying to them, nah, stop using Western models, they're not good enough. You got to start bringing our thinking and our way if you want to rehabilitate this land or you want to change or reform these river systems and water. Stop just shutting us out. And so I've had to do that with a couple of CRCs that are getting funding to do all this research, and they're not including our research or our knowledge in that research. So that's another big challenge for many universities.
All right, we're going to move on to the next speaker.